The unification of Egypt around 2950 BC marked the birth of the world's first nation-state. Today, this political and social structure seems almost inevitable. Our economic status, rights, responsibilities, and freedoms are all closely tied to the countries to which we belong. Except for Antarctica, every part of the Earth's surface falls within the borders of one of over 200 countries. But this has not always been the case. Prior to the late 4th millennium BC, states as we know them did not exist. Instead, people identified with their families, local communities, or regional affiliations. The idea of a nation-state was an innovation pioneered by the ancient Egyptians. Starting with Narmer, Egypt's early monarchs governed a completely new type of political entity. This posed a significant challenge: to create a sense of unity among a population scattered from the first cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean coast. The emergence of a distinct Egyptian identity stands as one of the greatest accomplishments of Egypt's founding rulers. Behind this effort lay a strong element of self-interest. The concept of divine kingship shaped Egypt's civilization, giving rise to its iconic structures like the pyramids, and influencing the construction of monumental tombs and temples that still survive. The prominence of monarchy in ancient Egyptian culture is reflected in the way we classify its 3,000-year-long history, from Narmer's rule to the death of Cleopatra. Unlike other civilizations that are categorized by technological milestones like the Stone or Bronze Ages, Egyptian history is organized by dynastic rule. Fittingly for such a deeply traditional society, this system remains largely the same as the one developed by Manetho, a priest and historian who lived over 2 millennia ago. Using temple records, Manetho divided Egypt's rulers into 30 dynasties, beginning with Menes, identified today as Narmer, the founder of the first dynasty around 2950 BC, and ending with Nectanebo II, the last king of the 30th dynasty. To provide a complete historical picture, modern scholars have added a 31st dynasty to include the Persian rulers who briefly took control of Egypt before Alexander the Great's conquest. The Macedonian and Ptolemaic dynasties, established by Alexander and his general Ptolemy, are not part of Manetho's original framework. Though these later dynasties were of foreign origin and marked a departure from traditional pharaonic rule, they still underscore the ongoing role of dynastic monarchy in Egyptian political life. In line with ancient Egyptian ideology, Manetho's dynastic history presents a continuous line of rulers tracing back to the time of the gods and, ultimately, to the moment of creation. This narrative reflected the official doctrine upheld by the pharaonic court, that the creator god Adam had established the pattern for kingship at the beginning of time, and each subsequent king was a legitimate successor in a divinely ordained tradition. In practice, however, the situation was more complex. During periods of political fragmentation, multiple individuals could claim royal authority in different regions of Egypt. For instance, Manetho's 22nd, 23rd, and 24th dynasties are now understood to have overlapped to some extent. Modern research has also shown that some of Manetho's dynasties, like the 7th, were likely based on misinterpretations of temple records and may not have existed at all. Similarly, the 9th and 10th dynasties probably represent one single ruling family rather than two separate ones. Despite these inconsistencies, Manetho's classification system has remained remarkably resilient. Its continued use today to structure the study of ancient Egypt highlights how central the institution of monarchy was to both his understanding of pharaonic civilization. Kingship, as a system of governance, was fundamentally Egyptian in nature. Among the earliest civilizations, Egypt stood out as the only one to adopt monarchic rule from the outset of its history. In contrast, Mesopotamia was composed of city-states that drew their identity from local temples. There, political and economic authority primarily resided with the high priests. It wasn't until later that a system of monarchy emerged in Mesopotamia, and even then, it never attained the same level of centralization or absolute power seen in Egypt. In the Nile Valley, kings appear to have exercised authority over the people from as far back as prehistoric times. Archaeological digs at the ancient royal cemetery of Abydos have revealed graves dating to around 3800 BC. One of these graves contained a ceramic beaker painted with what may be the earliest known image of a king. The scene depicts a tall figure wearing a feathered headdress, holding a mace in one hand and a rope restraining 3 captives in the other. The portrayal of subdued enemies and the recognizable combination of mace and feathered crown clearly indicate a royal identity, even though the individual likely governed only a small region. Evidence suggests that kingship was simultaneously emerging in other parts of Upper Egypt. A pottery fragment from Nut featuring a crown, along with a grand complex of columned halls near Nekhen, supports this idea of multiple early centers of royal power. By around 3500 BC, the symbolic imagery of kingship had reached a mature form, most notably in a burial site at Nekhen known as the Painted Tomb. The interior of this tomb was adorned with a plastered and painted mural illustrating a royal figure engaged in various ceremonial activities. The most prominent feature is a grand procession of boats, yet in one corner, the king is shown striking down 3 bound prisoners. This striking motif, first seen on the Abydos beaker, became the defining symbol of Egyptian kingship. It reappears on the famous Narmer palette, and continues to be featured in temple reliefs throughout the entire span of pharaonic history. The visual language of early kingship in Egypt was not only powerful but also remarkably persistent. As Egypt transitioned into a unified state, the artistic representation of royal power evolved rapidly, reflecting the shifting concept of kingship. This transformation can be traced through a series of ceremonial artifacts and commemorative carvings. One particularly noteworthy example is the so-called battlefield palette, an artifact similar in form to the more famous Narmer palette but dating to an earlier period. While the Narmer palette highlights the king as a human figure, the older palette portrays the ruler as a massive lion, trampling and impaling his defeated enemies across the battlefield. The purpose was clear: to present the king not merely as a man, but as an overwhelming, natural force. A similar theme appears in a contemporary carving at Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, near the second cataract of the Nile in Nubia. This inscription depicts the victorious Egyptian monarch as a giant scorpion, clutching a rope in its pincers that binds a vanquished Nubian leader. From Narmer's own era, an ivory cylinder portrays the king as a ferocious Nile catfish, striking rows of captives with a large club. The symbolism across these examples sends a unified message. Egypt's earliest kings sought to elevate themselves above their people by embracing a godlike persona. This trend reaches its peak with the Narmer palette. Its shape evokes a time when semi-nomadic cattle herders carried their possessions and used their bodies for ritual adornment. In such a society, face paint held significant ritual meaning, and palettes were cherished items. By Narmer's reign, however, the cosmetic palette had been repurposed into a symbolic tool for declaring the king's supreme authority and divine nature. The Narmer palette's design reflects a fusion of 2 worlds. The shallow recess once used to grind cosmetics is now framed by the elongated necks of 2 fantastical animals, known as serpopards. These beings, held on leashes by attendants, do not originate from Egyptian tradition. Instead, they belong to the artistic vocabulary of ancient Mesopotamia. Their presence on an Egyptian artifact highlights a period of vibrant cultural exchange between the Nile and the distant Tigris-Euphrates region. In their efforts to assert dominance and legitimacy, Egypt's early rulers borrowed and adapted foreign symbols. These borrowed elements served their purpose, but once Egyptian culture had developed its own visual language of power, most of these foreign motifs were set aside. The only notable exception was the Mesopotamian-inspired architectural style adopted for royal palaces and administrative buildings. The Narmer palette captures this turning point in Egypt's cultural journey. It marks the moment when Egyptian civilization, having absorbed outside influences, began to define and express its own unique identity. The contrast between prehistoric and historic forms of expression is evident in the portrayal of Narmer himself. On one side of the Narmer palette, he is depicted as a powerful bull, demolishing the walls of an enemy fortress and crushing his foes beneath his hooves. When the palette is turned over, this animalistic imagery fades into the background. Instead, the king appears in human form, triumphant and commanding. While the ideology behind royal power remained consistent, its visual representation underwent a dramatic shift. depicting the king as a beast was no longer fitting. His newly sanctified status required a more refined and elevated portrayal. Throughout history, monarchs have used ornate symbols to distinguish themselves from ordinary people. Royal regalia often serves as a visual shorthand for the multifaceted concept of kingship. In Christian kingdoms, for instance, a crown topped with a cross signifies the monarch's subordination to divine authority, while a scepter embodies strength balanced with justice. Ancient Egypt used regalia in much the same way, and many of its symbolic items trace back to prehistoric times. The earliest known emblem of authority in Egypt is a simple wooden staff, dating to around 4400 BC. Discovered in a grave at El Omari near modern-day Cairo, the staff was buried beside its owner. This basic instrument of control, a literal big stick, remained a lasting marker of high office in ancient Egyptian culture. However, as the institution of kingship evolved, so too did its symbols. That basic staff gave way to the scepter. One notable example is an ivory scepter shaped like a shepherd's crook, found in a royal tomb at Abydos. This crook became so closely tied to kingship that it was adopted as the hieroglyph representing ruler. When paired with the flail, or goad, it symbolized the dual role of the monarch, to guide and discipline his people. These symbols reflect Egypt's early pastoral society, in which the man who controlled the livestock held authority over the community. This legacy is echoed in another early symbol of kingship. It signified the king's embodiment of the bull's raw strength and dominance, providing a subconscious link to Egypt's pre-dynastic heritage. A crown, of course, is the most iconic symbol of monarchy. Rulers throughout the ages have worn distinctive headgear, not only to set themselves apart but also to elevate themselves above the people. The concept of the crown and even the nation-state may have originated in ancient Egypt. Reflecting their binary worldview, Egyptian kings wore two distinct crowns to represent the two regions of their realm. From the beginning of recorded history, the red crown symbolized Lower Egypt. It featured a short, squared base with a tall rear projection, fronted by a curled extension that resembled an insect's proboscis. The white crown of Upper Egypt, on the other hand, was tall, conical, and ended in a bulbous tip. This division suited Egypt's fondness for dualistic symbolism, but in truth, both crowns likely originated in Upper Egypt. Archaeological evidence suggests that the red crown came from Nut, while the white one emerged further south, near Nekhen. After Egypt was unified, it made political and symbolic sense to assign the red crown to the north, keeping the white one for the south. The Egyptians were masters at constructing traditions to serve national identity. By the middle of the first dynasty, the royal image makers combined the two into a single double crown, representing the king's authority over both lands. From that point forward, Egyptian monarchs had three crown types at their disposal, each suited to highlight different aspects of their power. While art could project royal authority in symbolic form, architecture amplified that message on a grand scale. Like many autocratic rulers throughout history, Egyptian kings were drawn to monumental construction as a way to showcase their might. From the birth of the Egyptian state, the monarchy skillfully used architecture to convey ideology. A specific architectural style was chosen to represent kingship visually. This design, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow in Egypt's intense sunlight, was originally developed in Mesopotamia during the mid-4th millennium BC. Just as with other cultural borrowings during the state's formative period, this palace facade style found favor with Egypt's early rulers. It had a foreign allure and a commanding presence. As a result, it was quickly adopted for royal buildings, including the palace in Memphis, the new capital and administrative center. This whitewashed palace, known as the White Wall, must have been a dazzling spectacle. Other palaces across Egypt were modeled on the White Wall, transforming this once foreign motif into a signature of Egyptian royal identity. Throughout the history of the pharaohs, both iconography and architecture played vital roles in communicating the ideal image of kingship to the Egyptian populace. These tools were particularly effective in a society where up to 95% of the population was unable to read or write. However, in the ancient world, the most significant threats to royal authority rarely came from the general public. Instead, the individuals a king needed to secure loyalty from were those in his inner circle. This small, literate elite held positions of power within the administration and were uniquely placed to challenge the reigning monarch. That said, these officials typically owed their positions, privileges, and prosperity to royal favor, and thus had a strong incentive to support the monarchy. Nevertheless, Egypt's masterful state propagandists developed a sophisticated strategy to solidify the king's authority among the educated class. Rather than relying on imagery alone, they turned to the written word. Initially, hieroglyphic writing emerged in the late prehistoric period to serve practical functions such as record-keeping and managing resources across Egypt's expansive territory. Yet it wasn't long before the symbolic and ideological power of writing was recognized. The Narmer palette offers an early example. Hieroglyphs are used to name the central figures as well as to describe the depicted events. Language, then, became a powerful means of defining kingship through the use of royal titles. While in today's Western societies most titles have lost their traditional authority, certain designations still echo older systems of deference and hierarchy. In ancient Egypt, by contrast, titles and names carried immense weight. The development of the royal titulary, or formal system of royal titles, was a deliberate and potent expression of the king's divine status. The oldest of these titles, predating even Narmer, was the Horus name. It linked the king directly to the falcon god Horus, the supreme sky deity, thereby portraying the monarch as a living embodiment of divinity on earth. This was a bold, unambiguous assertion. To question the king was to challenge divine order itself. This message permeated all aspects of royal symbolism. Official seals and inscriptions displayed the falcon god perched atop a rectangular frame enclosing the king's Horus name. This frame represented the palace gate, reinforcing the idea that the king, operating within his royal domain, did so under divine authority. A second title emerged during the reign of Narmer's successor, further refining the ideological presentation of the monarch. Written using the hieroglyphs of a vulture and a cobra, it emphasized the divine protection granted to the king. Nekhbet, the vulture goddess, was associated with the city of Nekheb in Upper Egypt, while Wadjet, the cobra goddess, represented the town of Dep in the Nile Delta. By appointing these two ancient deities as joint guardians of the crown, Egypt's rulers ingeniously wove local religious traditions into a cohesive national theology centered on the person of the king. This strategy extended beyond titles. The use of the red and white crowns to symbolize the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was part of the same ideological project. So too was the elevation of Neith, a Delta goddess, in royal naming conventions. Narmer's wife, for instance, bore the name Neithhotep, meaning Neith is satisfied. In this way, the major religious centers from the northern marshlands to the southern Nile Valley were absorbed into the ideology of kingship. The third royal title, introduced alongside the double crown, further expanded the concept of kingship. Known as Nisibidi, it was composed of two symbols, a reed and a bee. Though their origins are not entirely clear, their combined meaning was rich and multifaceted. This title expressed the king's role as the unifier of opposites. He governed both Upper and Lower Egypt, the fertile lands and the deserts, the domains of the living and the dead. Additionally, the Nisibidi title embodied the core duality at the heart of Egyptian monarchy. It reminded those around the king that he was not only a political leader, but also a divine figure on earth. This fusion of spiritual authority with political power made the king's position virtually unassailable. Throughout history, rulers have naturally understood the unifying power of ceremony and spectacle. Public rituals have always had the ability to generate loyalty and support among the population. The ancient Egyptians mastered these displays from an early stage in their civilization. A richly adorned stone mace head, discovered alongside the Narmer palette at the city of Nekhen, depicts an early ruler known to us as Scorpion performing a symbolic irrigation ritual. In the scene, the king uses a hoe to open a canal, while a subordinate kneels nearby, holding a basket to collect the displaced earth. The presence of fan-bearers, standard-bearers, and female dancers underscores the ceremonial significance of the event. This vivid depiction from Egypt's formative period illustrates how royal rituals were used to highlight the king's role as a bringer of fertility and order. Another mace head from the same archaeological find presents a different, though equally powerful, royal ceremony. This time, King Narmer is shown seated on an elevated platform beneath a canopy, adorned with the red crown and holding a scepter. Flanking him are his usual attendants. Behind them stand guards armed with large staffs, a reminder that even divine kingship required protection. The ceremony appears to focus on military triumph. Spoils of war and captured enemies are paraded before the throne. Nearby, within a walled enclosure, 3 captured antelopes are shown. This ideological parallel between war and the hunt, between the chaos of nature and political rebellion, would continue to resonate throughout Egypt's history. Recent archaeological interpretations of the ancient site at Nekhen offer intriguing new perspectives on early kingship. What had long been identified as a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus may, in fact, have served a different function, a ceremonial arena for royal rituals. According to this view, the central mound within the enclosed space could have been a raised platform from which the king made formal appearances. The open space before the platform may have been the setting for public ceremonies, such as prisoner parades. If this theory holds, the scene depicted on Narmer's mace head could be an artistic representation of an actual royal event. Additional artifacts from Nekhen suggest that these objects marked and identified ceremonial royal grounds. Extending this interpretation across Egypt, other structures previously labeled as shrines may also have functioned as hubs of royal ritual. In early dynastic records, the king and his actions dominate art and text, with traditional deities playing only secondary roles. This raises a provocative possibility. In the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, the kings were regarded as gods themselves. Monarchy wasn't just a feature of religion. This merging of divine kingship and ritual continued to shape pharaonic culture for millennia, but it came with a grim undertone. Looking again at the Narmer and Scorpion mace heads, the objects themselves reveal something fundamental about Egyptian royal authority. Since prehistoric times, the mace has symbolized power, likely because it is an unmistakable weapon of force. The choice to associate maces with kingship speaks volumes about the underlying nature of Egyptian rule. The scenes carved on the Narmer palette further reveal the brutality at the heart of royal power. On one side, Narmer is shown wielding a mace, about to strike down an enemy. On the reverse, the king is depicted surveying the aftermath of his victory, rows of headless corpses, each mutilated in a deeply degrading way. The victims' severed heads and genitals are placed between their legs. Disturbing though it is, this imagery suggests that such treatment of defeated foes was not exceptional in Narmer's Egypt. At the highest tier of Egyptian society, the king personified a relentless and unforgiving authority. Although he was often portrayed as the divine unifier of the land, a godlike figure who upheld cosmic order, royal imagery left no doubt that preserving this order involved ruthlessly destroying those who threatened it. Narmer and the kings who came before him had seized control through force, and they made no secret of their readiness to use violence to maintain it. The monarchy's visual propaganda was intentionally aggressive. It served both as a pledge of protection and a stark warning. One of the most disturbing images from early Egyptian art appears on the top section of the Scorpion mace head. This band of decoration features a series of royal standards, each representing a different facet of the king's power. However, these standards double as gallows. In hieroglyphs, the lapwings symbolize the ordinary populace, known in ancient Egyptian as Rikit, in contrast to the elite class that held real influence. On this mace head, the common people are literally shown being executed under the emblem of royal rule. This theme would reappear in later periods. For instance, the base of a statue of King Nedrikit, or Djoser, is adorned with carved bows and lapwings, suggesting that the king symbolically crushed both his foes and his own subjects underfoot. While many Egyptologists have recoiled at the symbolism of such imagery, its implications are undeniable. Absolute power is often maintained through coercion, and ancient Egypt was no exception. Perhaps the most chilling reflection of this harsh rule is found in the burial practices of Egypt's earliest monarchs. At Nut, an elite tomb dating to around 3500 BC contained more than lavish grave goods. Scattered around the chamber were human leg bones, and in its center, a collection of skulls. These remains belonged to individuals who had clearly been dismembered and buried with the tomb's owner. At Nekhen, several pre-dynastic burials show signs of scalping and decapitation, while at Adima, 2 bodies were found with their throats cut before beheading. One archaeologist initially suggested these might represent early cases of ritual self-sacrifice, where loyal retainers chose death to follow their master into the afterlife. However, burials from the First Dynasty at Abydos present a more unsettling reality. Royal tombs from this era included rows of subsidiary graves belonging to members of the king's court. In one example, every individual was young. Another tomb, from the end of the dynasty, featured a single roof covering both the king's burial chamber and the surrounding servants' graves. Such uniformity in death makes it impossible to believe these were natural deaths or voluntary suicides. Though once thought to be self-sacrifice driven by loyalty, more recent studies have shown that many of the bodies exhibit signs of strangulation. The conclusion is both grim and undeniable. Egypt's earliest rulers wielded absolute control over life and death, and they exercised that power to reinforce their dominance. For the average person, life meant subservience. For those within the king's inner circle, it meant living under constant threat. Neither path offered much comfort. The practice of retainer sacrifice reached its height relatively early in Egypt's history. The tomb of Jur, the third pharaoh of the First Dynasty around 2900 BC, was encircled by 318 subsidiary graves. It appears that, having secured absolute authority, Egypt's rulers were eager to exercise it fully. Those laid to rest alongside the king included not only human attendants but also his pets. That both dogs and concubines were considered fitting companions in death reveals much about the perceived worth of royal servants at the early Egyptian court. Following the reigns of Jur and his successor Jet, the custom of sacrificing retainers began to wane, and came to a complete halt by the close of the First Dynasty. However, one might question whether this shift was driven more by practicality than by changing moral views. Eliminating an entire group of trained servants at the end of each king's reign was a significant loss of skilled individuals. Evidence of human sacrifice also appears on labels from royal tombs. These small tags, once attached to containers of offerings, are etched with scenes of royal events. 2 such labels, seemingly linked to the same ritual, depict a bound man kneeling beside a large basin. Another figure stands over him, gripping a long knife, clearly poised to deliver a fatal blow. Though no inscriptions accompany the images, the purpose of this scene is unmistakable: the ceremonial killing of a human captive, most likely as part of a ritual connected to kingship. The royal tomb, through its contents, and the attendants buried nearby, was meant to ensure that the king could continue performing his ceremonial role for eternity. It became the cornerstone of kingship, and from the dawn of ancient Egypt to the end of the pharaonic era, each reign's most significant building endeavor. Preparing the king's burial demanded immense resources. It's often said that Egyptians undertook this task willingly, seeing it as their contribution to a covenant that secured the nation's well-being and survival. But this interpretation, unsurprisingly, originates from the monarchy itself. Promoting the idea that the king embodied unity and national prosperity served his own agenda. In truth, the king's motivations were largely self-serving. The royal necropolis at Abydos, where the ruler's tomb was surrounded by those of his followers, physically reflected the structure of Egyptian society. The development and enforcement of this ideology played a pivotal role in shaping pharaonic civilization, but it came at a heavy cost. With Egypt's unification, the steady advance of centralized state control had begun in full force. Ideology alone is never sufficient to secure lasting power. For a regime to maintain authority over time, it must also exert substantial economic control to support its claims to legitimacy. Rulers aim to influence both the material conditions and personal lives of their subjects. One of the key achievements during Egypt's first to third dynasties was the establishment of a truly centralized national administration. At the beginning of this period, Egypt had only recently been unified. Narmer and his immediate successors faced the daunting task of governing a vast territory stretching roughly 500 miles from inland Africa to the Mediterranean coast. By the end of this era, the state operated a tightly controlled economy that funded large-scale royal construction efforts. This accomplishment was the result of persistence, ingenuity, and above all, far-reaching ambition. Among humanity's most transformative inventions, writing holds a unique status. Its influence on preserving knowledge, wielding authority, and chronicling the past is profound. Today, it is almost impossible to conceive of a world without written communication. For the ancient Egyptians, the advent of writing must have been groundbreaking. Although the precise origins of hieroglyphic writing remain uncertain, growing evidence suggests it was the result of intentional creation. The earliest known Egyptian inscriptions have been found on bone tags from a pre-dynastic burial site at Abydos, associated with a ruler who lived over a century before Narmer. These inscriptions already used developed symbols, and the system displayed the complexity that would characterize hieroglyphic writing for over 3,000 years. Scholars continue to debate whether Egypt or Mesopotamia first conceived of writing. However, southern Mesopotamia appears to have the stronger claim. It is likely that the idea of writing reached Egypt as part of a broader wave of Mesopotamian cultural influence in the pre-unification era. Yet the writing system itself did not accompany this exchange. Egyptian hieroglyphs are so well adapted to the native language and so deeply rooted in the local environment that they almost certainly developed independently within Egypt. One can imagine a visionary figure at the court of an early ruler examining mysterious symbols on imported Mesopotamian goods and creating a comparable system for the Egyptian language. Though this may sound speculative, it resembles the documented invention of the Korean script by King Sejong and his scholars in the 15th century. There are few more plausible explanations for the sudden emergence of a fully developed hieroglyphic writing system in Egypt. Regardless of how it originated, writing was quickly adopted by Egypt's earliest rulers, who saw its immense value. In an era marked by rival kingdoms vying for influence, the ability to document the possession of goods and share that information was a remarkable breakthrough. From the outset, goods moving in and out of the royal treasury were marked with the king's emblem, specifically his Horus name. Items meant for the royal tomb carried tags detailing not only the owner but also specifics such as the contents, their quantity, quality, and place of origin. Initially created as a tool for accounting, writing was warmly welcomed by Egypt's administratively inclined society. Throughout Egypt's long history, literacy was confined to a small, privileged class within the government. To be a scribe was to hold a key to political influence. That close connection between literacy and power was established right from the beginning. Writing also had a profound impact on international commerce. Many labels found in the royal tombs at Abydos were originally affixed to jars of fine oil imported from the Near East. A notable increase in such imports during the First Dynasty coincided with the creation of Egyptian settlements and trade hubs across southern Palestine. At locations such as Nahaltila and Tel Arani, in what is now Israel, archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian imported pottery, locally made pottery in Egyptian style, and seal impressions featuring hieroglyphs. At En-Bissor, near modern-day Gaza, the Egyptian administration even established a logistical base to resupply caravans traveling along the coastal trade route connecting Palestine to the Nile Delta. Backed by state support, Egypt's foreign relations entered a phase of increased activity and connectivity. However, official narratives presented a different story. Domestically, the regime projected an image of proud isolation. In the official ideology, the king's sacred duty was to protect Egypt by defeating foreign adversaries, who symbolized disorder and chaos. To cultivate national unity, Egypt's rulers found it useful to portray outsiders as threats. An ivory label from Narmer's tomb, for instance, depicts a dignitary from Palestine bowing before the Egyptian king. In reality, however, Egypt and Palestine were actively engaged in trade. The official xenophobic rhetoric concealed the practical truth. This contrast serves as a cautionary note for historians of ancient Egypt. From the very beginning, Egyptians mastered the art of shaping the written record to reflect the version of reality they wanted others to see. While the written accounts are undoubtedly valuable, they must be examined critically and compared against the more objective findings uncovered through archaeological excavation. While Egypt's interactions with the Near East were marked from the outset by complexity and contradiction, its stance toward Nubia was far more direct and assertive. Even before the First Dynasty began, as the pre-dynastic kingdoms of Chini, Nut, and Nekhen were emerging in Egypt, a similar cultural evolution was taking shape in Lower Nubia, centered around the sites of Sayala and Kustal. This region exhibited signs of a budding civilization, including elaborate burials of rulers, a refined culture, and active trade with nearby territories, Egypt among them. Despite its early promise, Nubia's rise was abruptly halted. Both written records and archaeological findings convey a consistent narrative. Determined to secure control over trade routes and suppress any potential competition, Egypt's earliest monarchs acted quickly to neutralize the emerging Nubian threat. A striking example of this policy can be seen in the inscription at Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, which vividly depicts a giant scorpion clutching a defeated Nubian leader. Another nearby carving, dating to the dawn of the First Dynasty, reinforces the message. It portrays a grim scene of destruction, with fallen Nubians lying under the gaze of the Egyptian king's emblem. Unlike the city-states of the Near East, which could be tolerated due to their geographical distance and their role as trade partners, a neighboring power directly upriver posed a strategic threat that Egypt could not afford to ignore. After Egypt's decisive incursion into Lower Nubia, this portion of the Nile Valley did not emerge again as a serious political force for nearly a millennium. With its borders secure, dominance over the Nile Valley established, and thriving trade connections, the early Egyptian state experienced a significant increase in prosperity. However, this wealth was not shared equally among the population. Burial sites from the period of state formation reveal a sharp divide in grave sizes and the richness of offerings, signaling a growing disparity between the wealthy and the poor. The primary beneficiary of this newfound prosperity was the state itself. Political unification effectively placed all land under royal ownership. Although individuals and communities continued farming their plots as before, they now had to pay rent to a new landlord. The administration of the First Dynasty wasted no time in implementing a comprehensive tax system to capitalize on the country's agricultural output. Writing once again proved indispensable. From the very beginning of its recorded history, the Egyptian state used written documentation to manage the nation's wealth and enforce taxation. Some of the earliest ink inscriptions mention revenues collected from both Upper and Lower Egypt. For efficiency, the country seems to have already been divided into two regions for tax collection. The First Dynasty's desire to oversee every facet of the economy is evident in two key measures, both mentioned on the Palermo stone. The earliest entry refers to a First Dynasty king, likely Narmer's successor, and describes an event called the Following of Horus, which apparently took place every 2 years. This journey, undertaken by the king and his court along the Nile, served multiple purposes. Like royal tours in Tudor England, it enabled the ruler to maintain a visible presence among his subjects, allowed his officials to monitor provincial affairs, enforce policies, resolve disputes, and administer justice. Additionally, it helped reduce the ongoing cost of maintaining the court in one location by spreading the burden across various regions. Most importantly, it offered an organized method for evaluating and collecting taxes. By the Second Dynasty, the administrative value of the Following of Horus was officially acknowledged, and the journey was merged with a formal agricultural census. Starting with the third ruler of the First Dynasty, the Palermo stone also records annual measurements of the Nile's flood level, noted in cubits and fractions thereof. The reason for this meticulous tracking is clear: the height of the inundation directly influenced the success of the subsequent harvest. Knowing this would have allowed the state to adjust taxes accordingly, ensuring maximum revenue for the royal treasury. In the process of tax collection, it is reasonable to assume that a network of state officials operated throughout Egypt. Their work was undoubtedly supported by the use or threat of force. Inscriptions left behind by some of these officials, often found in the form of seal impressions, provide insight into the operations of the treasury, which stood as the most vital government department from the very beginning of Egypt's history. The agricultural goods collected as state revenue were managed in two main ways. One portion was directed straight to royal workshops, where raw materials were transformed into finished goods: tallow and leather from cattle, pork from pigs, linen from flax, and bread, beer, or baskets from grain. These processed items were either sold or traded to generate additional state income or redistributed as wages to state workers, helping to sustain the royal court and its initiatives. The rest of the collected produce was stored in government granaries, likely spread across key administrative centers. Some of this grain was allocated in its raw form to support court operations, but a substantial part was reserved as a contingency supply. This reserve was intended to cushion the impact of failed harvests and reduce the risk of widespread starvation. Whether this policy reflected true concern for public welfare or was simply a calculated strategy to protect state interests depends on one's interpretation. Regardless, the population did benefit from this early form of social safety net, although it came at their own expense. With a national framework established to evaluate, collect, and redistribute tax revenue, Egypt's early monarchs were able to shift their focus toward boosting output. As with most bureaucracies, the administration soon began to develop its own momentum and internal goals. Although improvements in infrastructure may have indirectly helped the general population, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that these advancements primarily served the ruling class. In ancient Egypt, growing national wealth tended to result in the construction of increasingly elaborate monuments that glorified the king, rather than in the creation of public amenities or the enhancement of ordinary living conditions. The government's prioritization of the elite becomes especially clear during the reign of King Den, who ruled in the mid-First Dynasty around 2850 BC. Over the course of his 3 to 4 decades on the throne, numerous innovations emerged across various areas, ranging from the evolution of royal titles to advancements in tomb construction. One such improvement was the introduction of a stairway leading into the burial chamber. Reforms weren't limited to the royal court. According to the Palermo Stone, agricultural lands in the Delta underwent a major reorganization during Den's reign, possibly requiring entire communities to relocate in order to establish royal estates. This suggests the government's role as a landowner was far from compassionate. This reassignment of large sections of Lower Egypt as crown property served as a precursor to more extensive administrative changes. To tighten control over the country, the state introduced a new system of local governance, dividing both the Delta and the Nile Valley into 42 provinces, or nomes. Each of these provinces was governed by a nomarch. In Upper Egypt, these divisions appear to have followed long-standing community borders that had their roots in ancient irrigation systems. However, in the Delta, where no such traditional divisions existed, the new provinces were likely drawn to accommodate the locations of royal estates. Regardless of their basis, this structured administrative framework replaced earlier, more informal allegiances and granted the monarchy significantly more centralized power. Reform efforts continued into the latter part of the First Dynasty. The increased number of high-ranking officials granted elaborate, state-funded burials points to a growing and more organized bureaucracy. At North Saqqara, leading members of the court constructed large mud-brick tombs, known as mastabas, along the cliff's edge. Oriented toward the sunrise and overlooking the capital, these grand structures symbolized both rebirth and the preservation of high social standing in the afterlife. Their facades, designed to mimic the White Wall of Memphis, underscored their connection to royal authority. After all, the king was the ultimate source of power, and most of these top officials were closely related to the royal family. One of the notable tombs at North Saqqara was constructed for a man named Hemika, who held the influential role of chancellor and chief of the treasury under King Denver. Among the items buried with him was a small wooden box, intricately inlaid and containing 2 rolls of papyrus. These artifacts perfectly illustrate the strong link between literacy and political authority in early Egyptian society. In fact, the earliest known autobiographical inscription from the Nile Valley appears on the tombstone of one of Hemika's successors. Merka, who served the final monarch of the First Dynasty, held an assortment of titles that reveal much about the nature of high-ranking roles at the time. Despite his various responsibilities tied to the royal court, Merka's prominence primarily stemmed from a prestigious religious position within the royal cult. For officials like Merka, advancement was entirely dependent on their closeness to the king. His eclectic mix of administrative, ceremonial, and spiritual titles reflects an early bureaucratic system that was still relatively fluid and undefined. Outside of the treasury, clearly defined roles were rare, and proximity to royal authority was the key to influence. The grand tombs built at North Saqqara for figures like Hemika and Merka were not simply rewards for faithful service. Rising above the landscape, they stood as symbols of authority and dominance. This architectural expression of centralized rule could be seen across the Nile Valley, from Giza and Tarkhan in the north to Jebel Ain and Armant in the south. The emergence of large-scale tombs designed in the palace facade style, towering over local communities, must have had a deep psychological effect on the population. The impact would have been similar to the construction of motte and bailey castles in England following the Norman conquest. The reach of the state extended into every region. A new era of control had begun. Another powerful demonstration of early state dominance took place at Egypt's southern border, on the island of Abu. At the dawn of the First Dynasty, the government rapidly established a massive fortified customs station there to control and monitor the flow of people and goods between Egypt and Nubia. That this fortress was constructed on a raised section of the island, blocking access to a local religious shrine, clearly showed where the state's priorities lay. Economic oversight and political dominance far outweighed any concern for local traditions or sacred spaces. From the very beginning of its history, the Egyptian state exhibited an assertive approach to governance. For the ancient Egyptians, the cost of national unity, administrative efficiency, and economic prosperity was authoritarian rule. The death of Ka, the final ruler of Egypt's first dynasty around 2750 BC, was commemorated with the customary royal burial rites at the ancestral necropolis of Abydos. His funeral procession solemnly traveled from his palace of eternity to his distant tomb among the graves of past monarchs. This burial site was carefully chosen to align with a distinctive gap in the nearby cliffs, believed by the ancient Egyptians to be a gateway to the underworld. Ka's remains were laid to rest in his burial chamber, accompanied by an abundance of offerings meant to sustain his soul in the afterlife. To serve him in death as they had in life, a number of attendants were buried in surrounding subsidiary tombs. Once the arrangements were complete, the tomb was sealed under the watchful eye of Ka's successor, the new king, Hatshepsut. The transition of leadership was smooth, signaling the start of a new reign. At first glance, there was little indication that Hatshepsut's rule would mark a significant departure from tradition. However, later historians recognized him as the founder of a new dynasty. This designation was prompted by his bold decision to break from over 3 centuries of royal burial tradition at Abydos and establish a new funerary site far to the north at Saqqara, overlooking the royal capital of Memphis. The exact reasons behind this dramatic relocation remain uncertain. Hatshepsut may have had familial connections to the Memphis region, or perhaps he felt that a royal tomb, as a potent symbol of kingship, should be placed at the geographic midpoint of Upper and Lower Egypt, rather than in a southern province. Regardless of the reasoning, the shift in burial location was accompanied by equally innovative architectural choices. Unlike the traditional mud brick structures aligned with the local landscape, Hatshepsut's tomb was oriented to true north and excavated directly into the rock. The tomb's layout also diverged from earlier designs. It consisted of a sequence of lengthy corridors branching off from a central passageway, instead of a central chamber flanked by storerooms. At its end, the tomb featured a suite of rooms that mirrored the private living spaces of a contemporary household. Hatshepsut clearly intended for his spirit not only to receive sustenance in the afterlife but also to enjoy the comforts of a fully equipped residence. The successors of Hatshepsut, Kings Nebra and Ninetjer, upheld his reforms and continued the tradition of royal burials at Saqqara. However, the apparent stability during the Second Dynasty concealed growing unrest throughout the kingdom. Around the midpoint of Ninetjer's reign, approximately 2700 BC, signs of internal conflict began to emerge. A cryptic note on the Palermo stone refers to the destruction of Shemare in the north, hinting at possible attempts by Lower Egypt to break away from centralized rule. This could account for the fact that the rulers who followed Ninetjer are largely absent from records in the southern part of Egypt. It's possible that the early dynasties' emphasis on Upper Egypt had fostered resentment among the northern population. Evidence from the later Second Dynasty suggests a deepening political divide. Several generations after Abydos had been abandoned as a royal necropolis, it was reinstated as the burial site by a ruler who made an extraordinary departure from tradition. Rather than aligning himself with Horus, this king identified with Seth, the god of the desert and protector of the town of Nut. This figure, known as Peribsen, ruled around 2680 BC and remains unique in ancient Egyptian history for this religious shift. While the exact motives for his decision remain uncertain, it's plausible that devotion to Seth resonated with his southern power base. Despite this departure in divine affiliation, Peribsen maintained many of the ceremonial and institutional hallmarks of Egyptian monarchy. His tomb at Abydos was consciously styled after those of the First Dynasty, evoking the early days of the pharaonic state. Notably, he was the first ruler since Ka to construct a separate funerary palace in the area, emphasizing continuity even in a time of upheaval. Taken together, the written and archaeological evidence from this period points to a time of crisis. The fragile unity achieved by Egypt's early rulers had been shaken, and the very foundation of kingship faced its greatest test since the era of unification. What Egypt required was a strong leader capable of restoring order and reaffirming royal authority before the entire system collapsed. That leader emerged in the form of Kasekum. It is possible that, without him, ancient Egyptian civilization might have stalled in its early stages, never achieving the monumental advancements for which it later became known. Kasekum, whose name means the power has appeared, embodied the resolve needed to guide Egypt into a new era. He stands as a pivotal figure, bridging the gap between a culture rooted in prehistoric traditions and a fully realized pharaonic society defined by ambition and monumental vision. Like Peribsen, Kasekum likely hailed from Upper Egypt and drew his authority from the southern regions. He showed particular favor to the city of Nekhen, commissioning statues and stone vessels for its temples and beginning the construction of an enormous enclosure behind the city. Known today as a fort, this structure remains the oldest surviving mud brick building in the world, with walls still standing 34 feet high more than 4,500 years after their construction. Kasekum's intention to rule as a conventional monarch was made clear when he reinstated the traditional royal titulary, presenting himself as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the sky god. In doing so, he reaffirmed the legitimacy of the monarchy and paved the way for the great achievements that would define ancient Egypt's golden age. Kasekum's determination to reunite Egypt was as essential to its future as his public demonstrations of royal power. His ambition to restore unity to the two lands and bring the entire country under a single rule was unmistakable. Two life-size statues of the king from Nekhen depict him wearing the ceremonial Jubilee robe, one of the oldest royal traditions. Notably, the statue's bases do not feature his titles, but rather graphic depictions of fallen enemies, twisted in defeat. The hieroglyphic inscriptions declare the figure 47,209 northern enemies. Similar imagery appears on stone vessels from the same temple, where scenes of victory are carved into the surfaces. The vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, Nekhbet, is shown standing atop a ring containing the word rebel, accompanied by an inscription that reads, "The year of fighting the northern enemy." These accounts appear to document a military campaign led by Kasekum to subdue rebellious factions in Lower Egypt and bring them back under central authority. His vision was daring, but with strong leadership, it quickly became reality. To commemorate the reunification of Egypt, Kasekum altered his royal name and titles in a symbolic gesture. He adopted the name Kasekemli, meaning the two powers have appeared, along with the phrase the two lords are at peace in him. For the first time, the symbols of both Horus and Seth were shown side by side above the royal name, signifying the reconciliation of opposing forces within the figure of the king himself. Unity had been restored, conflict had ended, and balance returned to the land. This renewed national unity brought about a fresh wave of economic prosperity and cultural revival, grounded in firm state control over the nation's wealth. The Palermo stone notes the reintroduction of a regular census encompassing both Egypt's mineral and agricultural assets. With replenished state resources, Egypt re-established commercial ties with the Near East. Unlike earlier periods, which focused on southern Palestine, the attention now shifted to the port of Kebni. To solidify diplomatic relations, the king gifted the local temple with a stone vessel bearing an inscription. In return, Kebni's merchants provided Egypt with two essential materials, cedar wood and tin. Cedar, in particular, was vital for constructing ships, as Egypt lacked its own supply of quality timber. Large seafaring vessels were crucial to maintaining trade across the eastern Mediterranean. An inscription from the 17th year of Kheskemwi's reign, around 2655 BC, references shipbuilding efforts. The results of Egypt's access to tin are evident in the royal tomb at Abydos, where a ewer and basin represent the earliest known bronze artifacts from the Nile Valley. The advancement of bronze technology, combined with increased trade revenue, enabled a surge in state-sponsored construction projects. Kheskemwi stands out as the most prolific builder in the early history of Egypt. He commissioned new temples throughout Upper Egypt and completed his cult enclosure at Nekhen before focusing his efforts on Abydos. Following the example set by his immediate predecessor, he selected this ancient royal burial site for his own funerary monuments. His enclosure at Abydos was even larger than the one at Nekhen and continues to dominate the surrounding landscape today. Regarding his royal tomb, the architects introduced a completely new design that blended traditions from both the first and early second dynasties. This approach seemed to declare that all previous advances in Egyptian civilization were now unified under his rule. Additionally, he looked forward to the future. His burial chamber was lined with meticulously cut limestone blocks on a scale never before attempted, foreshadowing architectural developments to come. It was once believed that Kheskemwi's construction activities were limited to Upper Egypt. However, recent surveys and excavations indicate that he also left a significant mark in the north. Deep in the desert at Saqqara, far beyond the usual tourist routes and even past where camel caravans travel, lie the ruins of a massive enclosure. This site is best seen from the air, as its walls appear on the ground only as low ridges. The size is enormous. Its local Arabic name, Jisr al-Mudir, translates to the enclosure of the boss. Partial excavations reveal walls made of massive stone blocks arranged in sloping layers, with solid masonry corners. Although no inscriptions have been discovered to definitively date Jisr al-Mudir, evidence increasingly suggests that Kheskemwi was its builder, making it the third grand enclosure constructed during his reign. Once completed, it would have been the largest and most impressive royal monument Egypt had ever seen. In this way, Kheskemwi ushered the nation to the brink of a new era.